And it's been copied by many developed countries. So for example, the European Commission is basically, the way they deal with this stuff is based around how it works in the US. Other Commonwealth countries like the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. And it also exists to some extent and unevenly and in a less structured form in the developing world. So in many developing countries, there's actually no law against mergers. And this includes Peru, where I've been working on trying to write a law against mergers. In other countries, there is a law, but there's basically no infrastructure to enforce it, so it's only on paper. In other countries, there is some infrastructure, but there's very, very little involvement of economists or economics in it. It's basically done by lawyers or on a political basis. And a few countries have sort of tried to implement a more sophisticated infrastructure. So China, Brazil, and Chile are three good examples of that have come quite a ways. But it's very heterogeneous across the world. And while most of the field of industrial organization that I work in focuses on trying to figure out very minute details of various types of contracts that people might do in the US, one of the really big issues is just that many countries in the world really have no infrastructure for dealing with this stuff. And there's basically, cartels running around buying up whoever they want. So I think, one really important agenda item is just bringing basic competition policy to developing countries. Okay, so the traditional way that these agencies evaluated whether a merger should be allowed or not was based on so-called industry concentration. And they, and the way that they tried to think about industry concentration is that they wanted to treat an entire industry as a single product. They want to sort of act as if there's just one market for the products of all the relevant firms. And is Justin here? Yeah, Justin. How did they try? How does the process? What's the process they go through for thinking which firms are in the industry?
One of them is a couple of different factors. One of them is geographic, like cost of transportation to bring products to different consumers.
Have a very particular algorithm that they go through. So what they do is they start with the two products that are merging, and then they gradually add into the market the products that are closest substitutes for those products. And that's based on the two factors that you said, which products are close to one another physically, and which are sort of close in product space, which are sort of similar. So for example, if there were different supermarkets merging, you'd want to, and they were both in California, you wouldn't want to add supermarkets that only operate on the East Coast. But you also wouldn't want to add into the market for two super premium grocery stores like Walmart or something like that, because that probably doesn't compete that heavily with a super premium store. And they call something a market when they reach the point where someone who owned all of the products in that group would, if they had a monopoly over all those, have an incentive to increase the prices by a small but significant and non-transitory amount. That is usually interpreted as about 5% at least for at least 1 year. Yeah?
Is it the hypothetical monopoly test?
This is called the hypothetical monopoly test. They say if someone were to have a monopoly over this market, then they would have an incentive to introduce a small but significant and non-transitory increase in price, or 5% for 1 year. Then they seek within that industry is thus defined to measure how concentrated the industry is. And does anyone remember how they measured concentration within the industry? Yeah. What's your name again? Chen. Yeah.
They first measure the number of significant competitors in the market.
Yeah.
The second one is to measure the HHI, where it's like this summing of the scales of the individual market
That's absolutely right. So that's exactly what they do.
And for the HHI, they want to measure too. So the first one is the post-merger level of HHI. So
That's exactly right. So there's this thing called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, or HHI. And what is that? Well, let's let the firm's share of the industry, little qi over capital Q, be sigma I. Then the HHI is the sum of the squares of the firm's share in the industry. And sometimes you multiply this not by 1,000, but by 10,000. Sorry, there's a mistake there. Now, 1 over H is the approximate number of firms in the industry. Why is that? Imagine that there were 5 firms and they all had the same 1/5 of the industry's production. Then this would be the sum of 1/5 squared, right? Which is 5 times the sum of 1/5 squared, which is 1/5, right? So this is sort of a quantity-weighted index of what fraction of the industry everyone has. And so, you know, if the HHI is around 2,000, that says that there's roughly 5 firms in the industry. If it's around, 3,300, there's roughly 3 firms in the industry, and so forth. And from Bresnahan and Race's analysis, it suggests that we should start being worried if we start getting down to around 3 to 5 firms in the industry. You can also relate so that's one reason why we might think that HHI is useful. Another reason is Stigler found a way to relate it to the possibilities for collusion. And it's also somewhat related to the Cournot model. So remember that in the Cournot model, price minus cost is equal to derivative of price times quantity. If we multiply this by capital Q and then divide this by capital Q, you get that that becomes the price over the elasticity, and then that's multiplied by the share. And so if we then sum across all the firms in the industry, multiplied by their markup, then we find that the share-weighted markup in the industry, so sort of like the average markup that consumers pay, is equal to the Herfindahl index divided by the elasticity. So it sort of gives a measure of the markups that consumers pay. And what they usually do is they look whether H is greater than 1,800 after the merger. So if there's like roughly going to be less than 5 firms after the merger, and or the merger causes the HHI to rise by 300, in which case they view the merger as potentially problematic. Unfortunately, this is kind of a nice little standard, but it's proved very cumbersome to apply in the real world. And the reason is that it requires every product either be like exactly the same as all the products in the industry, or totally different. And that's a little bit silly. So there was a merger between Wild Oats and Whole Foods a couple of years ago. And the question that the whole thing was the debate over whether the market was the market for luxury organic groceries or the market for all groceries. And the answer is, well, it's true other grocery stores do compete with Whole Foods and Wild Oats a bit. But it's like, it's not like either all grocery stores are the same or even that Wild Oats and Whole Foods are the same. And they're all different. They're all competing with each other to different extents. And like either putting every store either being exactly the same or being completely outside is sort of a silly way to approach it, right? What really matters is these like diversion ratio things that we were talking about before, right? And second, the relevance of industry concentration is a bit unclear. Because for example, in a Cournot industry, concentration will rise most in cases where there's a really efficient firm that's taking over a really inefficient firm, and that's exactly the beneficial case. So it's not at all clear that that's the right way to think about things. So that's the merger guidelines, which are guidelines issued by the agencies, which I had you guys read, and represent sort of the official policy about how they're going to evaluate mergers and how firms can think about how they're going to approach mergers, has been moving away from just looking at this. So these guidelines are issued about every 10 years since 1980. And until the most recent guidelines, they were focused on this market definition and concentration idea. But there was recently a revision, which I was involved with and there was also a similar revision in the United Kingdom and in Europe. And the new ones are based on this notion of upward pricing pressure that we talked about a few slides back. They explicitly talk about diversion ratios and markups. They were designed by Carl Shapiro and Joe Farrell, who are two Berkeley professors, who were respectively the chief economists at the DOJ and the FTC, and were the original creators of the idea of UPP. And progress along these dimensions is still ongoing, and new future guidelines may reflect some of the ideas that we talked about earlier. For example, the United Kingdom just commissioned a report on how to incorporate conjectural variations into UPP and so forth. Okay. But there's a number, I think, of pretty key considerations which show up in the merger guidelines, which we didn't discuss today. So one of those is efficiencies, right? The reason that you don't just block all mergers is that there may be, economies of scale, and this is the main offsetting force. We didn't talk about how to quantify that at all today, but you can imagine that it's, there's some direct benefits in terms of reducing fixed costs. There's also a benefit of reducing marginal costs that will reduce prices because of pass-through. There's entry of new firms into the industry, right? So if firms try to raise prices after they merge, other firms might enter into the industry to compete with them. And that can reduce their ability to raise prices. They might change things other than prices, right? They might change quality or the product range, and that can have Spence effects and all the sorts of effects that you explored on the problem set and that we talked about in class a couple weeks ago. And these might either exacerbate the effects because the Spence distortion gets worse, or in some cases it might make things better because of, say, adverse selection. I might be charging, when we're competing, too high of a price because I don't want to get your really sick patients. When we merge, I could actually reduce my price potentially because of that. There are effects on innovation, potentially. So it may change firms' incentives to invest in research and development. Also, firms may merge because the people who are buying from them have a monopsony, and their merger may give them more power to offset that monopsony, and that might be a benefit of the merger. Okay. And finally, those things all show up in the merger guidelines, but as usual, some of the most interesting issues, I think, are the ones that don't even show up. So for example, pass-through, even though we saw that it played an important role, doesn't show up at all in the merger guidelines. Another thing is that, usually the way that merger disputes get resolved is not that you just block the entire merger, it's that you settle and you require them to sort of divest some part of their business. And, figuring out which things should be divested, figuring out what the effects of different interventions would be, requires a specific analysis of that intervention, and that's not included anywhere in the merger guidelines. Similarly, we talked a lot in the intellectual property lecture about the effect that monopoly power has on which firms want to create what products, which firms want to enter the industry. And we didn't talk about that at all here, right? We only talked about the effects that it directly had on prices. But allowing firms or not allowing them to merge creates different profits, and that can incentivize different firms to enter the industry. So that's an important part of merger policy. And that's something that I'm working on with Jean Tirole, but it doesn't show up at all in the merger guidelines. Another big issue is that firms might merge just so that they could get too big to fail, so that the government would have to bail them out if they get into trouble, right? And that's not really considered in the merger guidelines anywhere either. And in fact, that was a big driver, I think, of the giant wave of bank consolidations over the last 20 years, which the government didn't do anything to control because it wasn't included in the standard way of thinking about merger policy, because they weren't thinking about too big to fail. Another, this may help firms achieve bailouts from the government, but it's not necessarily in the public interest, right? And finally,